My family isn't rich, but we aren't dirt poor either. As long as I can remember, my parents and I have lived in the quaint 2-bedroom, yellow house out in the country. Sure, roof shingles fall off every now and then, and when the heavy rain comes, the living room ceiling leaks. But for the most part, the place has embodied safety and warmth. Of course, there's something about our house that makes it unique, at least to me. When I was 10, I discovered the Knock Knock game. I called it that. I wasn't very imaginative back then, and the name seemed fitting enough. The game started late one night when I was meant to be fast asleep. It was summer, and my mind was too occupied with planning the next day's adventures to drop off into sleep. I sat there in bed, flashlight grasped in mouth, pen and paper in hand. I remember I was drawing a fort diagram when I got the urge to sneeze. With a muffled "achoo," my flashlight was flung from my mouth. It rolled off my bed and across the floor, coming to a stop with a light thunk against the opposite wall. I held my breath for a moment, listening. My parents were strict about my bedtime, and I didn't want to risk being grounded for any length of time during my summer vacation. A minute passed, and then 2. Nothing else seemed to stir in the house. I let out a relieved sigh, and sucked it back in a moment later when I heard a light knock coming from the wall where the flashlight had hit. I sat there in bed, silent and still, hoping the sound had been nothing more than just my imagination. Another knock sounded a few seconds later. Slowly, I crept out of bed and tiptoed my way across the room. I pressed my ear up to the wall and gently rapped my knuckles 3 times against its surface. I only had to wait a few seconds for a response. Knock, knock, knock. The repetition of my own knocking rhythm both frightened and delighted me. I knew whatever was responding to me had to be sentient. Was it a ghost? An intelligent critter? The house itself? To my youthful mind, the possibilities were endless. I sat there in my room that night, playing the knocking game with my newly acquired friend. Every sequence of thumps I concocted was echoed back to me. Occasionally, the other entity would add some of their own, usually a quick succession of knocks, as if they were trying to convey something. Eventually, dawn broke, and I heard my parents waking. The knocks stopped, and I went back to bed. The next day, I planned to conduct my own investigation. I knew the wall across from my bed was shared with my parents' closet. I had been in there a few times prior, but the heaps of clothing and musty boxes never proved all that interesting to me. Before heading to the kitchen for breakfast, I poked my head into the small walk-in room. Just like before, it was a mess of clothing and objects, but no otherworldly beings. I meant to examine that shared wall some more, but was shooed out of the house for the better part of the day. My parents were always doing that, encouraging me to go out and play. That night, I waited until the house was silent and crept back up to my wall. I knocked once and waited. Almost immediately, the other players surfaced, and our knocking game resumed. I played the knocking game for the next several nights. Each following day, I tried my best to discern who or what was responsible for the knocks before I was exiled from the house, but each time I was unsuccessful. Eventually, curiosity got the best of me. One morning at the kitchen table, I worked up my nerve and told my dad about the knocking. He looked annoyed, if not a bit angry. "You're supposed to be in bed by 9. What are you doing up so late?" I mumbled an apologetic response and pressed the topic further. My father shrugged his shoulders. When I asked what the source of the noise could be, he responded curtly, "It's possibly mice. I'll put some traps out this afternoon." I could see he was done with the topic, and while I didn't subscribe to his theory, I didn't say anything more. That night, the knocking didn't return. I attempted to get my friend to play the knocking game, but silence was the only thing that greeted my knocks. I tried for a response of any kind for a long time after that. Weeks passed, then months, and finally years. But nothing ever happened. Until a few days ago. I'm 15 now, nearly 16. The knocking game had faded to the back of my mind, so when I heard the raps against the wall last Friday night, they startled me. Knock, knock, knock. It was that same sequence that had started our game all those years ago. Thoughts of my invisible playmate resurfaced, and I rushed across the room. My knuckles thumped against the surface in greeting. It was as if my presence was a catalyst. The once measured raps became a frenzy of beats against the wall. Frightened now, I backed away and threw myself under the covers of my bed. My childhood playmate seemed far more sinister now that I was older. The knocks continued for a little while longer, but eventually the sound faded into silence. The next day, the knock-knock game and my friend consumed each waking thought. I was at that point deeply disturbed by the specter. Who was it? What was it? This time, I was determined to find out. Saturday, after a day of spring cleaning, my parents treated themselves with a night out in the city, a rarity for them. I took the opportunity and snuck back into their closet. Given the amount of trash bags they carried out of the house that day, I was surprised to see the old clothes and boxes still littered the floor. Pushing aside the clutter, I made my way to the room's narrow back wall. I knocked, wanting to see what might happen. I held my breath, hoping that my playmate wouldn't emerge. The closet remained silent. I went to knock again, just to make sure. And when I did, I noticed something. The echo of my knock had an odd, hollow sound. I pressed my ear against the wall's surface and rapped some more. There was definitely something strange about the reverberation. I felt along the edges of the wall, running my hands along the wooden baseboards. Then I felt it, an odd gap in the wood. To the naked eye, it looked as if the baseboard was merely chipped, but it was enough of a space that I managed to hook a finger into it. I tugged, and to my astonishment, the wall swung outwards. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dark space. When they did, I shuddered with revulsion and horror. The room, if you could even call it that, was no more than half the size of the closet. The stained wooden floor housed a small pile of ratty blankets. Shoved into one corner was a molding cardboard box. The thing that captured my attention, however, was the heavy chains that hung from the rightmost wall. I felt sick to my stomach at the discovery. My mind was a whirl of thoughts, each more horrifying than the next. I don't know why, but some force compelled me to enter the space. On my knees, I pulled the cardboard box towards me and looked inside. Its contents consisted of a paperback book, some crayons, and a handful of newspaper clippings. I put the book to the side for a moment and snatched up the newspaper articles. They were all similar in nature. Missing persons reports. Missing girls, to be precise. I shuffled each scrap of paper and read the titles. Indiana child snatched from yard. 5-year-old Cassandra White yet to be found after local park searched. Toddler's family adamant they had nothing to do with her disappearance. I looked at the most recent article, one from 12 years prior. Search for 7-year-old Jane yields nothing. Beneath the headline was a small blurb and a picture of a young girl, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed beauty. Feeling anxious, I put the papers down and picked up a book. It was L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Opening the Browning cover, I saw words scrawled there that stopped my heart. The first part read, "From Mom and Dad," and underneath was "To," followed by a series of crossed out names. Some, but not all of the names corresponded to the missing girls in the articles. The latest to be crossed out was Jane. Beneath that, I saw my own name written. Hands now shaking, I flipped through the book, searching for more clues. I came across a bookmark of blonde hair on page 128. It was the portion of the story where Dorothy seeks help from the Wizard of Oz. There, in crayon, several words and sentences had been circled, again and again. I read through them in order. Send me back. The first read, I am only a helpless little girl. Read the second. It was the last circled line that really got to me though. Help me, and I will help you. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway reached me, and I flung the book and papers back into the box. Rushing, I leapt into the closet and slammed the hidden door back into place. I was just exiting their room when they came through the door. I'm not sure if they saw me exit, but the man I called father gave me an odd look. My mother came in then. She was beaming. "We have good news," she said. "We're adopting another child. How would you like a sister?" I couldn't speak. It took everything in me to slap on a fake smile and nod. That was the other day. Since then, they've been keeping a close eye on me. They've made excuses as to why I can't leave the house. I lay awake at night in the silence, afraid and wondering what I should do. There are no neighbors close by this far out in the middle of nowhere. There is only one car, and they have the keys. What should I do? Home no longer feels safe. After reading through your replies the other night, I began to weigh my options. I considered making a run for it. Out the front door. The cold and snow be damned. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I could lie and say I stayed because I wanted to help the next girl, want to discover what's really going on. But the truth is, it was fear that kept me bound to the house. You see, we recently had an unexpected visitor. We don't get too many people out here in the middle of nowhere. So when I heard the doorbell ring, I took note. I'd been keeping to myself at this point, but as soon as I heard the sound, I cracked open my bedroom door and stuck my head out. From my vantage point, I had a partial view of the front entrance. Though I couldn't make out the face of our visitor, I could hear him and my parents conversing. The new voice that spoke was so low and rumbling that it washed over my being in near tangible waves. As it flowed over me, it brought to the surface a faded memory. I saw in my mind's eye my 4-year-old self. She sat crying on the bottom of a bunk bed. A girl, slightly older, knelt on the floor before her. She swept a lock of blonde hair off of her forehead. It had been covering a large dark bruise. "It'll all be okay," she cooed, trying to shush the child. I'm going to get us out of here. They won't expect us to run. She placed a pair of shoes on the younger girl's feet and pulled up off the bed. She brought a finger to her lips before leading them to the bedroom door. It opened with a soft snick. They were about to step through the doorway when the smaller girl called out, "Wait!" She rushed back to the bed and fished around under the pillow at its head. A moment later, she pulled out a paperback book. Its spine was just a bit brown from age, and some of its papers were clearly dog-eared, but for the most part, it seemed in good condition. The blonde girl smiled when she saw the book. The large cartoonish lion on the front always amused her. "We can't leave Dorothy behind," the little girl stated. The blonde didn't answer, but she plucked the paperback from the child's grasp and tucked it into one of her back pockets before once again taking the girl's hand. The hallway in front of them was awash with shadows. They tiptoed their way through the darkness, heading for the kitchen and its back door. The older girl had reached out to grasp the doorknob when the kitchen light flicked on. The two girls, huddled together on the precipice of freedom, froze. The man they called father stood there. Fear rooted the younger girl in place, but the older knew what was at stake and made to rip the door open. It stuck. A deadbolt, newly installed, halted its movement. Just then, the blonde was yanked backwards by the large hand fisted in her hair. Her scream was abruptly cut off as the man belted her across the face. "You little," his voice was a low hiss. "After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us." He smacked her again, and this time, the older girl fell to the floor in a heap. Blood trickled from her top lip. Before she could gather her breath, Father reached out and once more grasped a handful of blonde hair. He dragged her from the kitchen, back in the direction of his room, unperturbed by her struggles. The younger child, left for a moment by herself, finally moved from her spot by the door. She shook as she listened to the shouts of the man. A drop of blood on the floor, a neat circle of red, captured her attention. As she stared at it a moment, a thought came to her. She dragged one of the chairs that sat around the kitchen table to the far wall. There, a corded phone was mounted, carefully and quietly, but the sounds down the hallway had lessened some. The girl picked up the phone and dialed 911. She held her breath as the dial tone turned into a gentle ring. No more than a few seconds had passed when a man's voice, one that was deep and rumbly like a bear, the girl thought, answered. "Emergency services. What is the nature of your emergency?" The words rushed from the girl's mouth. "My sister's in trouble. I think my dad is going to kill her." The voice on the other end took a measured moment to respond. "Can you tell me a little more about what's going on, sweetie?" She swallowed a sob. My dad hit my sister. She's bleeding. He's very angry and I think he's hurting her." The man with the deep voice rattled off a street address. "Is this where you live?" The girl barely managed to get out a yes before he continued. "I'll have one of my friends there in a jiffy. Sit tight and stay out of your dad's way, okay?" A muffled thump sounded from down the hall, and despite the man's warning, the girl hung up the phone and proceeded towards the doorway to the kitchen. Cautiously, she made her way towards her parents' bedroom. The light was on and the door was open. Inching closer to the room, the girl peeked around the doorframe. Inside, her mother stood near the bed, wringing her hands. Her gaze was fixed within the confines of her closet. The girl couldn't see within that space without giving away her presence. The clinking of something heavy could be heard coming from within the closet, and she debated inching forward just a bit more into the bedroom for a better vantage point. Before she could, however, a heavy hand landed on her shoulder. The girl let out a little scream and whirled to see a tall, slender man in a police uniform standing there. Though he wore a smile on his face, his blue eyes were so cold and piercing, he frightened the girl. She instinctively took a step back from him, further away from the bedroom door. "Why don't you go on back to bed? I'll take care of things here." He didn't give her a chance to respond, but rather gave her a little shove back in the direction of her own room. Entering her parents' bedroom, he shut the door behind him. The girl rushed forward and pressed her ear up against the wood. She could barely make out a murmur of voices from within. Snippets of a conversation reached her. "She given you trouble again?" Her father's response was unintelligible. A laugh sounded from the tall man with the dead eyes. This time, she heard her father retort, "I don't know why we kept this one. She's been nothing but trouble." "Sure you do," said the other man. "You know what a fine breeder she'll make." The girl was too young to know what the word meant, but she shuddered at the man's lecherous tone. Muted sounds, sobs mostly, could be heard over the conversation then. The girl pressed her head against the wood paneling of the door and let out a soft cry of her own. "Jane, Jane." The words once more trembled from my lips as the present intruded my thoughts. The man was just finishing up his conversation with my parents. "The girl should be here the day after tomorrow. You'll have everything in order by then?" My father answered in the affirmative. They spoke for a moment or two, and then I heard the front door close. Afraid my presence would be discovered, I ducked back into my bedroom. I sat on my bed and digested all I had heard and had remembered. I struggled to bring back more memories of my childhood from the back of my mind, but all that I could summon up was a headache. Who was this Jane to me? Was she my sister? And what had happened to her? I had more questions than I did answers at this point. However, I knew where I might find some clues. The secret room. The trouble was in sneaking my way back in there without detection. Some deity must have heard my pleas for assistance, for not an hour later, my father announced he was heading out to the grocery store. That left just myself and my mother in the house. I waited until she was completely ensconced in her favorite TV show to make my move. Quiet as a mouse, I made my way down the hallway and into my parents' room. The closet door was open, and I left it that way, as I went straight for the back wall and the door hidden there. The secret room wasn't quite how I had left it. The blankets that had been thrown in a heap in the middle of the floor were now folded and placed against the back wall. The chains were still there, as was the cardboard box and its contents, which was my destination. Carefully, I picked up the aging paperback. This time though, I held it more reverently, like it was an old friend. I opened it, and bypassing the name scrawled in the front, I flicked through the pages. I was hoping that I missed something the first time. All the pages before 128 were left untouched. I stared once more at the handful of phrases circled there. Before moving on, I saw that same shade of crayon on page 189. This time, it was a mix of solitary words and partial sentences that had been circled. They read, "Very bad man, need, baby, I, very unhappy, you must find, and a way to." were the last things circled on that page. I flicked through more pages, but saw no signs of any crayon marks until I got to the last page. There, a library card sat in an off-white holder. Underneath, written in crayon and underlined numerous times, was one word: escape. I pulled the library checkout card from its pouch and glanced at the pen marks there. The card was so old and the ink so smudged that none of it was legible. I did see, however, a stamp bearing the name of our town library on it. Was this meant to be some sort of sign? Why else would the word escape be written there, just below? Perhaps whoever had left this message knew of an alley that could be found within the old brick building downtown. It was the only lead, only plan I had at the moment. I had to find a way to get to town. I put the book back and hurried out of the hidden room, closing its door. I was lost in thought as I made to exit the walk-in closet. I had just exited when I saw that my mother stood in the bedroom doorway. I froze. "What are you doing in here?" she asked. My brain flittered through various lies as fear turned my stomach to lead. Just then, an idea formed in my mind. "My pinky!" I cried, cradling my left hand. "I think I might have strained it. I was looking for some bandages to make a wrap." My mother reacted as I'd hoped. She hurried over to me, and tisking, she grabbed my left hand. "Why didn't you tell me? We need to get this looked at, it might be broken." That's how I got her to bring me to town. As expected, the doctor found no broken bones, and we were sent on our way. Only on the way back home, I managed to convince her to make a stop. The town library. She did so reluctantly. "I'll give you 10 minutes, no more," she said. "I'll wait in the car." My heart leapt in joy at that. I made my way through the building's front door and headed to the librarian's desk at the back. A young lady sat there sorting through books. She wore a heavy sweater and her head was covered by a large knit hat. She looked up from her work with a pleasant smile. "Can I help you?" Having had the car ride over to formulate my plan, I replied easily, "Yes, I'm hoping you could recommend a book to me. One like The Wizard of Oz." If this lady was someone the message leaver had trusted, then surely she would recognize the significance of that book. I was watching her intently, so I saw when her whole body stiffened, an odd light came into her eyes, and she looked at me more closely. She opened her mouth to say something when a man came up from behind. I stiffened when I saw who it was. The tall, slender man with the lifeless blue eyes. "Hello, honey," he said to the librarian. He placed a caressing hand on her shoulder, which she immediately shifted away from. "Am I interrupting something?" "I was just signing out a book to this girl here," she replied, voice taut with stress. Before I could voice any objection, she grabbed a book from the corner of her desk and handed it to me. I glanced at its cover, Alice in Wonderland. "You should be all set," the lady said to me, a meaningful look in her eye. She stood then, and I could see for the first time her lower half. Her stomach was round with child. I gulped and looked her once more in the eye. I nodded. "If you ever need anything else," she went on, "and I'm not at my desk, just knock and I'll hear the sound. Things echo here." As she said this, she knocked not once, but 3 times on the wooden desk surface. I tried not to react, but at that moment my mind was in chaos. The pattern of knocks, I knew it immediately. I gave my thanks and turned to leave. Just as I made it to the door, the man called out, "Be careful." He paused for a long, weighty moment before continuing, "It's icy out there." Though his tone was pleasant enough, I could hear the threat hidden in there. I nodded and rushed out the door. That was all this afternoon. I'm sitting here in my room with the new book in my lap. I haven't opened it yet. I'm afraid of what new message I might find. Begin at the beginning. This time, the words were circled lightly in pencil. I had to flick through the book Alice in Wonderland a few times before I spotted them. They were near the back, in the chapter entitled Alice's Evidence. I didn't know if this was intentional or not, but it seemed fitting. I had hoped that this new message might provide some insight into what was going on. Begin at the beginning was hardly the sort of thing I was expecting, however. The 4 words were so vague without additional context. They were as nonsensical as the characters in the book. I went back through the pages more carefully this time. I found just one more circled word, grave, in the same chapter, just a few pages prior. Frustrated, I tossed the book across my bed, despite having stained my eyes examining every smudge within the paperback to ensure it wasn't lead marks. All I was left with were these 5 cryptic words. The message, if you could call it that, was hardly helpful. Grave and begin at the beginning might as well have been the Mad Hatter's riddle. Why is a raven like a writing desk? For all the good it did to me, neither seemed to actually have a solution. I wondered then if the lady at the library wasn't an ally after all. Perhaps I was just being toyed with, or perhaps I was the mad one. Maybe the scribbling in this book, and the one I had found in the secret room, were nothing more than the work of bored children. I had no proof the initial message had been from Jane. I buried my head in my hands. I was running out of time and options. The new girl, my new sister, was due to arrive within 24 hours. I either had to get the hell out of Dodge and leave the girl to face whatever reality was happening here, or I had to figure out a way to collect some more information. Chin cupped in hands, I allowed my gaze to wander back to the book, which now lay askew on the edge of my bed. The cover of the Dover Thrift edition of Carol's Classic was annoyingly bright yellow. The shade was such that it caused the red blocky tile to jump off the page. It also allowed, I noticed then, for any impurities to stand out. In the upper left portion of the cover, directly in the path of the illustrated Alice's gaze, was an odd-looking blemish. When I had first looked over the book, I had dismissed it as a regular liquid stain, a byproduct of its many borrowers. But now that I examined it more closely, I saw that its shape was deliberate. The thick half circle could have easily been mistaken for a watermark left by a glass, and the lines that radiated from its curve might have been splatters. But when observed as a whole, the marks came together to form a design. If someone cared to stare at the stain long enough, and had seen a bird in flight, they might have shrugged and chalked it up to the pareidolia. I, on the other hand, was familiar with the particular avian shape in my forced exploits outdoors. I had seen it often enough. It was the metal dove that marked the entryway to the town cemetery. The smattering of graves was tucked up on a hill, just down the dirt road from my house. While it was true that there weren't that many people living in close proximity to us, There were certainly plenty of dead ones. I thought about the circled words again. Grave, in particular. Jesus. Could they really mean for me to go triapsing through a graveyard? What the hell sort of information could I glean from bones and stones? A heavy breath was expelled from my lips as I gave in to the urge to sigh. The cemetery was only 15 minutes away by foot, and I could easily come up with a reason to go for a walk. My parents had, as of late, become a bit laxer in their watching of me, most likely because I've been playing the part of the perfect daughter. I really had no excuse not to go. At least, if I didn't find anything, I would know I was chasing ghosts. And if I did manage to find a glimmer of information, well, then I'd be one step closer to the truth. The snow had begun to melt some, and the air wasn't quite as chilly. As I made my way down the country road, the sun was out, and I could see in the distance gray specks sprinkled about all the white. The hill where the weathered graveyard lay wasn't all that steep. As I made my way up its slope, the ancient iron archway came into view. It bore the phrase, Ad Pecum, above which was mounted the metal dove. I had looked up the strange words some years prior, after a voyage to the cemetery, and had discovered they meant towards peace in Latin. As I took in the fading names etched in stone, I gave a shudder. I hoped that these people were in a better place, since the one in front of me was desolate and lonely. Though I had been to the cemetery before, my stays were always brief, and I had never taken the time to read more than one or two of the old stone markers. Now I went down each row, carefully examining the inscribed words. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I hope I'd recognize whatever it was when I saw it. The front of the cemetery contained the oldest graves. The front ones were from the 1800s. I passed by those quickly, as I didn't think anything that dated would prove useful. Madison, Smith, Williams. The names weren't ringing any bells. I passed by a few more markers when a large ornate headstone caught my eye. Owens was printed in large letters across the top of it. Underneath were the names of 3 people and 3 sets of dates. Don, March 8th, 1946, July 11th, 1979. Matthew, September 14th, 1969 to July 11th, 1979. Leslie, April 6th, 1971 to July 11th, 1979. Whoever these people were, they had all died on the same day. I tried to summon up what little town history I had knowledge of, but the date didn't ring any bells. I continued on for a few more headstones when I spotted the date again. This time, it resided on the headstone of an individual. Johnny Diggs, the name read. Born January 13th, 1962. Died July 11th, 1979. Underneath the name and dates was the epitaph, Beloved son, victim of the beast. I stared at the inscription a moment, trying to decipher the last bit. Victim of the beast might be a line one would expect to read in a fantasy novel, but it hardly seemed befitting of a tombstone. I wasn't sure what they meant by beast. Was this man, this teenager, killed by some sort of wild animal? We were out in the wilds of the countryside, but aside from the occasional coyote, there wasn't much around here that would kill a person. My gaze drifted over to the next headstone, and I froze as I read the name carved there. Alice Billings. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather settled over me. Billings was father's and mother's last name, my last name for all I knew. I took in the rest of what was written. June 5th, 1963, July 11th, 1979. Beloved daughter. Though I read and reread the words several times, I had trouble digesting them. The surname was uncommon enough that I knew this was no coincidence. I did some quick calculations and concluded the girl would have been 16 when she died. It was close enough to my age to disturb me. The people who called themselves my parents had never mentioned anyone named Alice. Granted, they never mentioned Jane or the other girls either. Aside from the newspaper clippings and the names scrawled in the old library book I had found in the hidden room, there were no reminders of any of them in the house. Alice Billings, though I had never heard the name spoken, it felt as if it had held significance. Could this be what the message in the book was pointing me towards? A few names and a date didn't seem like much. As I pondered their meaning, I did another sweep of the cemetery, checking for July 11th, 1979. None of the other graves held that date, and I could find no other inscription of significance. As I made my way back towards the house, I racked my brain once more for any local historic tidbits I had memorized. Despite my best efforts, I could recall no fire, no storm, no epidemic, no anything that would have occurred on that date. But I knew where I might find the answer. The library held in their possession an archive of every paper produced by the Daily Pioneer, the only newspaper devoted to things going on in the area. If something had occurred on that date in this town, then they would have written an article about it. I got Mother to drive me into town, under the pretense of needing to return the Alice in Wonderland book. Thankfully, she had a hair appointment at a salon a block away, and readily agreed to drop me off. I made my way into the library and headed straight for the back. This time, the librarian's desk was empty. I considered knocking to summon my mysterious ally, but decided against it for the time being. I slid the Alice book into the drop-off slot and headed to the left. In the corner were a few microfilm readers, and next to that, a series of filing cabinets, which contained the entirety of the Daily Pioneer's archive. Each drawer was labeled by decade. I pulled out the one marked 1970s, thumbing through the folders, each one tagged by a month and year. I found the one marked July 1979, carefully extracting it so as to not drop any of the microfilm stored within. I made my way over to one of the readers. Loading the machine was easy enough. It was sorting through the piles of material that was the hard part. It took me nearly 30 minutes to find the newspaper from July 12th, 1979, and 10 additional minutes to find what I was looking for. On the second page of the edition of the Daily Pioneer was the headline, 5 dead in 2 car accidents. My heart began to race as soon as I saw the words. The number of fatalities aligned with the number of people buried up in the cemetery from that time period. I scanned through the article. Mr. Owens, 33, was found to be at fault when his truck crossed over the center line, striking the vehicle of Johnny Diggs head-on. Owens' children, aged 9 and 8, were passengers in his vehicle at the time of the accident. All 4 were pronounced dead at the scene. Miss Billings, who was a passenger in Mr. Diggs' car, was transported to the hospital, where she succumbed to her injuries. There wasn't much else to the block of text I flipped through a couple more microfilm panels and saw another article from a few days later that referenced the accident. This one, however, had a picture attached to it. It showed what looked like a funeral service. A crowd of somberly dressed people formed a half circle around two open graves. I squinted, trying to make out any of the faces in the crowd. Hitting the zoom button, I nearly tipped my chair over as I slammed backwards in surprise. In retrospect, I suppose I should have expected what I found, given my discovery at the graveyard. Set apart from the crowd were 4 people, 2 couples by the looks of it. One of the pairs was my parents, though my mother was only in profile, her tear-stained face tucked into the shoulder of my father. I knew it was them. To their right was another man and woman. The man, big and burly, looked to be supporting the small woman at his side, though both looked as if their world were falling apart around them. I read through the attached article, and one more piece of the puzzle fell into place. Johnny Diggs and Alice Billings were laid to rest today. Knowing how fond the two were of each other in life, their parents, Mr. Anthony Diggs and wife Kathleen, and Mr. Robert Billings and wife Elizabeth, decided on a joint ceremony. No date has been set for the burial of Don Owens, whose autopsy has yet to be concluded. Authorities expect the toxicology report to confirm that Mr. Owens was intoxicated at the time of the accident. As I removed the microfilm from the machine, I weighed my options, though I now had physical proof that my parents had been hiding things from me. I had no evidence yet to tie them to Jane, or any of the other missing girls. A curse tumbled from my lips as I glanced at the clock. I was due to meet back with Mother in 10 minutes. I hurriedly stuffed the film back into a manila folder and returned the sheath to the appropriate filing cabinet drawer. I made for the entrance of the library, and as I passed the section of tall bookshelves set aside for nonfiction, I heard a whispered conversation. I glanced into the gap between shelves and saw the tall, blue-eyed man conversing with the librarian. Her head was uncovered today, and long wavy locks of blonde hair fell around her shoulders. The two of them formed an intimate picture, heads bowed closely together, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, where she seemed tense in his presence the other day. Today, removed from prying eyes, she seemed at ease with him. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their conversation seemed harried and intense. Not wanting to make my presence known to them, and needing to get a move on, I continued to the front door. I had 5 minutes remaining to get to the hair salon. Mother didn't like to be kept waiting. Somewhere to my left, I heard a booming voice. I glanced in that direction and saw a young man dressed in black. He held in his hand a Bible, which he waved frantically as he shouted at passers-by. At first, the words didn't register, but one in particular garnered my attention. I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. I shivered. Beast. There was that word again. Since my attention was fully affixed to the zealot, I was no longer paying attention to where I walked. I slammed into a hard surface and bounced back with an oomph. Gaining my balance, I straightened and saw a broad, masculine chest covered by a police uniform. My gaze drifted upward and collided with a pair of large brown eyes. They held an expression of vexation. I took in the rest of the man's face then, and realized with a jolt that it belonged to the man in the newspaper article. A one Mr. Anthony Diggs. If memory serves me right, you'd do well to be careful. The deep voice was befitting of the large man. It was low and rumbling, and it triggered all sets of bells and whistles within my mind. The visitor to our house, the dispatcher. It was the same gruff entity. I swallowed and found my voice. Yes, sir, sorry about that. Not wanting to stand a moment longer in his presence, I resumed walking. I'm not sure what his role is in all of this, but I'm positive he's a key player. I walked a few feet when I got an urge to glance behind me. I did, and saw the man was staring across the street at the religious fanatic. His expression had morphed into something else entirely, something akin to pride. I made it to the salon with a minute to spare. As I got into the car with Mother, she beamed and informed me, "Wait till we get home, I have a surprise for you." I humored her with a smile, but my thoughts were on the long ago car accident, and Alice, and everything else I had seen. When we pulled up our driveway, I spotted Father in the doorway. I froze as I saw he was not alone. Tucked into his side was a little girl, no more than 5. Her hair was a mess of brown curls, and her pink polka-dotted dress looked rumpled. Her brown eyes were so big and round that even in the distance I could read the wariness lingering there. Mother gave a chuckle as she turned to me. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but in that moment, it sounded like it belonged to someone unbalanced. "Time to meet your new sister," was all she said before exiting the car. The door slammed shut, and I sat for a moment there in silence, panicking and feeling so very alone.